All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to another episode of the CX Chronicles Podcast. Super excited for today's show as we are welcoming Alister Esam. Alister, say hello to the CX Nation, my friend.
Hello. Well, thanks for having me on.
So we're pumped to have you on, Alister. Today's gonna be a fun chat. Guys, Alister's just had a really interesting background and journey. He's done a ton of different things with a bunch of different companies, always focused on the customer, always focused on the team that's serving the customer. So I'm excited for him to join us today and share his story. Alister, why don't you kick us off, my friend? Spend a few minutes just sort of setting the stage for all of us. How'd you get into the world that you're in? How did you get into this space? And how did you kind of start off your own customer focused business leader journey?
So I was I trained as an actuary when I left university, and I did that for a few years. Couldn't wait to get out of it. Most dull profession. I prized it, and it's quite something. Not many people train as an actuary and then escape to do something else. It tends to capture you for life and until you retire. So no, I did that till I was about 30, which I considered to be a little bit of a waste of my life, but it was probably a useful experience. And then I left there and I ran another business for a little while with a guy who really wasn't great, and I learned how not to run a business. So that took another few years of my life, and then eventually I kind of set up a software as a service business, although we didn't call it that back then. It was a product called Board Packs, and it was electronic board papers for board meetings. This is like 2003, and software as a service wasn't a thing. And it wasn't easy to get funding, so I bootstrapped it, built that business. From a customer service point of view, we had because I bootstrapped it, we had very little money to spend on the product. So what we could do is invest time in our clients. And I think that's an interesting thing for startups, is that, your focus is, people will forgive a lot about your product if they're looked after, cared for, and made to feel important and respected.
Absolutely.
So I ran that business, gradually built it over the years. 2007, 2008, people started bandying the phrase software as a service around. I thought, hey, that's what we do. I just thought it was, my dad rents farm buildings out. He was a farmer. I thought it was cool that you could rent software. There's no limit. He's got a limit on the number of buildings he can rent out. I had no limit. I could just keep replicating this software and renting again. So I just thought it was a cool business model. I built that, got to a point where it was about 70 odd people, and decided to exit it. Was getting a bit bored. So I exited that, and that kind of set me up. So since then, one of the things we did in that business was we were very process focused. I'm sure you'll come onto it. And we developed a product to help us manage all our processes, which wasn't controlling, it was kind of empowering. And off the back of that, I decided I was going to take it. This product had done wonders for me and the whole kind of ethos behind it. I decided to take that to market. So that's what we've been doing the last few years. Written a book called The Dirty Word, which kind of supports that and backs up and explains the kind of the ethos and why it's called The Dirty Word, because process is treated like a dirty word. People get it wrong.
Yeah.
Do that, and I'm currently an investor in about 20 different, typically SaaS startups, but not all SaaS. And they're all most of those are doing very, very, very well. So yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's super cool. So first of all, I think it's always awesome to hear the different steps and the different paths that people come across in their journeys. I want to go back to the company that you built, and just before we even dive into some of the things that you're doing with Process Bliss today, but that must have been an incredible experience. Number one, you spent a big period of your life building that. Number two, you mentioned up to 70 teammates, successful exit. That must have really kind of given you a sense for just number one, how you mentioned focusing on customers, and you mentioned like one of your biggest competitive advantages, or one of your biggest things that you could do early on when you're a startup. And a lot of the folks who are listening to this show, they're working at startups, they're building startups, or they're at some of these rocket ship companies that are already kind of crushing it and they're on their way, to becoming the next public company. But for you, I love that you talked about the focus, the customer side there as a competitive advantage. what was some of the ways that you guys early on, specifically before you guys got big, Alister, what was some of the ways that you guys would do that customer focus? Was it just general customer meetings, regular working sessions, regular engagement? Was there other little tips and tricks that you found that worked really, really well, or maybe unique things that you guys were doing to make sure that your early customers knew how maniacal you guys were about helping to build your product and build your customer success offering for them?
I think when you're a small startup, the key thing, and I think it's true, just so you understand where your product market fit is, the key thing is to get yourself involved in the business as you're dealing with as much as possible. You don't worry about the amount of money you're making or losing or whatever's happening. You just got to, if a client, even now in our current business, if a client will let us sit in their offices and work with them and see how they work and spend time with them, then we just love to do that. We'll travel to do that. We just enjoy doing that. And that's important for two reasons. One is because you build a relationship which gets you over the hump. And
yep.
I mean, the experience, where I am right now with the Process Bliss business is fascinating because we're doing all that and we know it's the right thing to do. And the customers that we have are loving what we're doing. They're making great case studies. They're spreading word of mouth. They're telling consultants about us that are getting. So it's that's gonna kind of, that's free marketing, free sales that just expand.
Yeah, totally.
So getting in and building those relationships is absolutely key. But by doing it as well, you also understand what their needs are. So you end up developing the product more. But the thing I find amazing, and I think it's interesting for your audience, is it's so easy to excel at customer service. I mean, I'm in a SaaS world, and so many people don't look after their customers. I mean, we had one of our clients the other day. We were doing a case study with them, and I said, "Why did you choose Process Bliss?" And I was hoping it was because of our great feature here or our great feature here. And they said, "Well, right. We looked at your main competitor, and I basically couldn't get a call with them. I couldn't get hold of them. They didn't call me back. They didn't." And she said, "If they don't look after me if they look after me like that during the sales process, what's it going to be like when I come on board?" And it's just amazing how I don't know. It seems like certain people get to a certain size where it's really hard for them to. It may be to do with your 4 pillars that they start to put in place process, and they kill all the personal interaction because people become machines that are just kind of dealing with them, and and then people become demotivated.
Yeah.
And so they great experience. So for me, that was all about. What was nice was we kept that going as well. So we did that early on. And as the business grew, right until the end, when I sold it wasn't the end, but when I sold it, there was this culture of just looking after the clients. And so give you an example on that. Once we got to being successful and still rolling out, a lot of we would have a client come on board, and they would want us to go up to the north of England 5 times to meet them, and we'd be like, a lot of people would say, well, that's just not worth it for the amount of money. Logically, that made no sense. But we just didn't care. We would do that. If that's what they wanted to become a happy customer, then we would lose money on the client because we'll make money on clients elsewhere. It's fine. But I think too many people, the FD gets involved and starts saying we shouldn't be doing this anymore. But the thing about that is those clients are going to bring me more clients.
Totally.
They're my best sales force,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
See what these guys did. I don't know how they make any money, but they look after you.
Yep.
And that really matters.
It does. It really does.
So I think it was nice. I don't think we did it intentionally, but I think the point I'm making was that kind of early push on customer service, which we knew was important, transformed into a culture which maintained its way through, and we never let anyone break that by coming in and just pointing at the numbers.
Yeah, Alister, I love that piece of advice right out of the gates here, man, because you're right. When you are mature and you figured everything out as a business and you're 10 years down the line and everything's kind of been sorted out and you've got a huge portfolio and there's a lot more leniency because financially you're in a safer or a more comfortable spot. Fine, start picking some of this stuff up and start looking at the numbers and start getting really good about your resource allocation management and get very mathematical about like what type of resource. Okay, fine. But when you're building these businesses and you're trying to figure out how the hell to create a solution, a product, a service for a market that maybe still needs even a little bit of help understanding why the need is so imperative or why like you gotta have some extra help in this. At that point of the business, I love that you're saying this. You got to be flexible. You got to be pliable. You got to be almost like wide open to where any new customer could potentially bring your business. into a completely different field, right? Like, and again, you got to do this within reason. You can't have people pulling you into completely different industries or maybe you can. There's a lot of examples where companies have started off thinking that they were going to go down one path, and then they made the pivot due to customer suggestion, customer demand, customer feedback. And then all of a sudden they created, completely wildly different successful companies. But you're right. I love that piece of relationship, the listening and the constant attention. I think that's huge. Alister, I'd love to jump into the first CX pillar of team. And we're already kind of getting into this, but spend some time talking about your team at Process Bliss. And then I'd love for you just to spend a few minutes talking about, you've worked at all these different companies, you've built several companies, you're invested in companies. I'd love to just kind of hear you kind of think about what some of the most core focus areas that you've seen incredible business leaders really focus on that's driven success for their business and really kind of push their companies into the future.
So the core focus, I missed the last bit.
Really just give us a sense for some of the things that you've seen along your journey that have been paramount focus areas for building teams and really kind of growing and scaling and helping to support a team.
Yeah, so my team at Process Bliss is really small. It's about 10 people. So we're back to startup phase. So I sometimes regret my decision to kind of give up my larger team, which I was growing at sort of 50% a year.
Yeah, right.
That I was a bit bored, so no regrets. It wasn't a bad thing. So no, we're starting again quite small. So customer service for us is it's kind of like it's one sort of, well, we're all customer service, right?
Yeah.
So we're all looking after the customers, and but there is a key person that drives that. So that's where we're at right now. Growing your team, I think it's the point we were on earlier about culture and about setting the right. I look at things that we did. Culture's difficult, because I don't think you can choose a culture. You've got to kind of believe it and live it and be it. So all the little things that we did for our customers as we grew our team impacted on our culture, even though we weren't doing them from a culture point of view. So, for example, I mentioned my sort of first business and those early clients we looked after. What that morphed into, because as we got bigger, they got settled down. They didn't need to talk to us. So we organised. We've got a horse racing circuit, a race course in Newbury. So
okay.
So I used to book a box once a year. It ended up being 3 boxes. I used to book a box once a year, and I used to invite all these customers to come along. And in the end, we ended up inviting all the customers who we had a relationship with.
That's awesome.
Which was thousands, right? So anybody was welcome. But it was really the ones that nobody, all the recent ones didn't really come and attend because we didn't have quite the same relationship as we grew. But the early ones were still coming. The customers were still coming. And I'd have people there who were a customer and then left the company 10 years earlier, but they would still come along to the race day. And
that's cool.
That kind of stuff that we did it because we wanted to do it. But I think it's surprising how that impacts on culture, because all your team get to sit and mingle with the clients for a bit and understand all that. But also they kind of see that you really care about these clients. You're really looking after them. You haven't forgotten your early clients who got you off the ground that are now meaningless in financial terms to you, but they really matter creating the business. Never forget those. And I think that culture drives its way through your whole business, as well as just in terms of building teams everywhere. So I mean, I think it's interesting. There were loads of things like that I can think of, but it's really about naturally developing a culture where people just care about the clients. And I think what kills that sometimes, and what the biggest mistake people make is, when we touched on it earlier, is when people put process in place and they put it in place in such a way, because your 4 pillars, when you look at team versus process, there's a massive conflict there between those two things. And when people put process in place, all of a sudden, the ability for me to look after that customer and do a good deed gets taken away from me because it doesn't fit with the process. I no longer have a remit to be myself and to treat the customer how I see fit. I'm no longer empowered. It's all stolen away from me. And so that means that I kind of that kind of drives me to get demotivated, but it also means that we can't nuance things for the customers like we used to. And I think there's a key there to kind of putting process in place in such a way that you don't mess that up.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, sir. It's especially in these early phases of growing a business, you're right. It's almost, process can be a slippery slope, especially as it relates to team, where it's over engineering process early, over engineering some of the more methodical or the more cut and dry items that have to go into the day-to-day management of your customer set, it could stifle a team that's growing. It could stifle a team that theoretically every new customer relationship, it's creating all these new opportunities. And then it's also, it just, and I mean, you were talking about this the other day, I was sort of like, also each customer brings a whole new set of learnings and findings. So then every new customer, you're like, wait a minute, you learn those 2 or 3 brand new things that make you think of, and then you bring that to the next 10 customers. And there's almost like a compounded interest, which is one of the cool parts about building a business. It's literally like, as you keep growing out your customer base, you're compounding that knowledge, compounding some of the things that are really kind of setting them apart, and you're baking it into the next, customer's experience, which is incredible. On the team side, one follow-up question before we move into tools. If there's been, like, I guess 1 or 2 things that you've done with all the different teams that you've led and all the different teams that you've helped to consult and advise, what would be like the 1 or 2 things you want today's listeners kind of thinking about that they should remain hyper focused on when it comes to just their general team leadership? For example, has there been certain meetings that have always worked for you? Is it certain one-on-ones? Is it just like you mentioned the community, you mentioned the horse races and getting more of a social, right? So that teams can actually build bonds. But would it be like 1 or 2 things that you'd want the listener to kind of take back to their team tomorrow?
A couple of things, I suppose one thing as a suggestion, I think people are starting to do this now. I find the way that people appraise, if you use the word appraisals, I hate the word appraisals.
Yeah. Yep.
The way that people communicate with their teams and provide feedback and look after their development. I find so many companies that do that once a year. And I think that's just, it's laughable.
It's crazy.
It's just nuts. People you're working for that are working
every day
to have that discussion once a year.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's difficult in a startup when you're small, and then probably that's a hard thing. And also when you're small as a startup, I think people are a little bit more bit more grown up, if you like. They're kind of in it with you. You're all in the team together. But when you get to a certain point and you start doing these things, I think I really think that needs to be a monthly. It needs to be a monthly, and it doesn't have. The thing is as well, I think people put off that because appraisals can take so long, and I think that. Personally, I think they don't need to. You cap it at half an hour, but you make sure that there's a standard agenda, and you go through it every month, and you discuss how's it going from your point of view, how's it going from my point of view, and what do we need to do for you going forward, and agree some outcomes. And it's literally half an hour every month, and then you're kind of not doing this once a year thing, which is often pay reviews, which is ridiculous as well. It's very unfair that you get a crazy
right.
pay review,
and it's a little unbalanced. I love that.
The other thing I would say, which is that's a specific. The other thing I'd say, which is more cultural, is I think you need to build a culture of empowerment, and we kind of touched on it already. But you've got however big your business is, you've got all these brains in your business. And they're all bringing something to the party. All those brains are brilliant in their different ways, and you've got to harness that to develop the most you can from your business. And the way to do that is to make sure that they're empowered to make decisions and to do things. I always think there's a book called The Art of Action. I can't remember the author, but it's quite a hefty book. But he talks about the way that armies transformed over the years. And armies used to be. The guy at the top used to plan the battle, and these people are going to come in from this direction. The cavalry is going to come in from this direction, and it was all planned, and it would never go to plan because battles don't work like that.
Right.
What the book sort of explains is that over the years, people started to kind of refine that to the point where actually what you do is give them the simplest possible mission, and it's up to them how they achieve it. And if they get it wrong and they screw up and they make a mistake, then you reward that as opposed to punish it, because at least they use their initiative, at least they use their brain, at least they're trying to do a good job.
Right.
And I think it's like that with your team. They will let them make mistakes. If they do something, it's fine because that was their idea. They need to be empowered to do that, and I think then you will get so many more brains working in your business and motivated.
Yeah, totally. Yep. And I guess, and remember, Alister, what you're saying right now, we're seeing it in probably historic numbers with the global talent migration that's happening. So great point, which is like, smart people want to go work with other smart people. They want to be empowered. They want to know what their areas of accountability, responsibility, and authority are. And then they want to go build and play and build and collaborate. And you're right. And we're seeing this right now, man, because the world is watching a lot of A players moving from one company to another company. And that's all of the things that you mentioned. That's what they're in search of. Alister, I'd love to pick your brain on the CX pillar of tools, right? Spend a couple minutes just kind of talking about how have you and your teams, and certainly how is the Process Bliss team, how do you guys kind of manage just working with different customers' toolkits, working with your own toolkits? We just talked through the whole swab of the team side. I'd love to kind of just hear you spend a couple minutes talking about what you've learned along your journey with tools and how you can really kind of optimize and leverage them appropriately to build your business or to help scale your business.
Yeah, when you say tools, what do you sort of?
So realistically, so with many of the folks that are coming on the show, they're talking about maybe the different types of CRMs or the different types of issue resolution management systems or their ticketing systems. Obviously, there's like just a laundry list of different communications tools for how people are kind of communicating with their customers. And this is kind of one of the things I love about this part of every one of these shows is like, there's so many tools that one could argue part of why so many companies and so many organizations have many of their dysfunctions is toolkits aren't managed appropriately, and tool utilization is something that only really mature companies think about that. And then lastly, there's too many companies out there that don't have their internal tools talking to each other so that people can really kind of see the big picture or the whole view of what's going on with their customers and with their team. So I just kind of love to hear some of the things that you've seen along your journey with how companies have really kind of done a dynamite job of managing and leveraging their toolkits.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's another place that Process Bliss fits in our business. In that, so we have like most businesses, we have 10 times as many tools as we do.
Yeah, right.
You've got intercom, you've got CRM systems, you've got little things for so we can monitor UX experience of people in the product. We've got the software products just all over the place, and it's quite astonishing. A lot of them are free, which is fantastic, and it's difficult, as you say, to connect them all together. They kind of, because they're all brilliant and they're all developed for specific purposes, they kind of work well in isolation, but it's difficult sometimes to connect them all together. So, and this was true in the larger business board packs that I used to run, or eShare it's called, but in that they, you'd got kind of systems with huge amounts of data in, and you could invest in getting them to talk together, but a lot of the time that was kind of very difficult to do. So you had to kind of accept that they were little isolated silos. One of the things we did, which is where Process Bliss fits in really, was it kind of formed a glue that kind of organized things together. So if you imagine something like customer onboarding, you've probably got some sort of recruitment tools. You might have LinkedIn in there for doing stuff like that. You may have spreadsheets in there for kind of how you look at your candidates. You've got all the CVs in a Google Drive folder. You've got kind of I know what happens when they come on board. We need to go to Xero to set up the payroll. We've got our appraisal system. We've got our HR systems. It goes on and on and on. So if you look at something like, sorry, I think about employee onboarding. If you look at something like employee onboarding, an employee coming on board like that, you've got hundreds of tools. If you actually look at the process can glue them together, because the process says, when you recruit someone, first of all, do this. Yep. When they come on board, do this and do this in this system. When they do, and it kind of defines how they should all fit together and how we communicate. And it's the same with customer onboarding. If you look at customer onboarding, you've got tools for signing contracts. You've got your CRM tools. You've got your Freshdesk or your whatever you're using, your Zendesk for your support. You've got Intercom. You've got all these different things that need to be connected together, and data needs to be transferred between them, and the customer needs to flow through them. And again, you've got invoicing, financial systems, and the process can glue together all of those kind of things and make it seamless and make it work for the client. And the process can also kind of connect back, if you like. So, if there's often what annoys a client is having to be asked for the same thing twice. They provide their data at one stage. So the process can also solve things. And the other thing the process can do is it can kind of help you kind of make sure that if something does happen, you get an unhappy client come on board. What the process can do is, the process is the place. If you've got it embedded properly in your business, the process is the place where you can go to make the change to make sure that that issue that client's had never happens again.
Yep. 100% agree, man. You're absolutely right. That's why I think so many modern growth focused companies, on one hand, they do a phenomenal job of really trying to leverage their tools and their technology to be able to essentially create all of those given processes that their team or that their customers are going through. On the other hand, what you joked about with 10 plus tools, 20 plus tools, that's also where at some different points of the journey there is breakdowns, or there is disruption, or there is internal consternation or external consternation that sort of develops. But I think that the net of it, Alister, it's like, bottom line, having folks on your team who are having these conversations. I love your point earlier about just like, this can't be a once a year audit, even on the tool side, right? Because of how intertwined tools and process are, this is like, I would argue monthly, there needs to be at least a high level assessment and reviews of just how the general toolkit health is going. And then it's definitely an external conversation for the customer side. And then it's definitely an internal conversation for your employees, right? Because if your employees are going to be, just miffed about the way that you're kind of leveraging your tools, or even what tools you're using, to your point, you mentioned a bunch of some of the global leading tools, right? Some of the biggest software companies in the world, some of the tools that you mentioned. And it's important to call that stuff out, because there's huge opportunity for your customer experience and your employee experience inside of that world. Alister, we've already talked a ton about process, but I'm going to ask you a different question for the third CX pillar process day, because we're wrapping it in all the pillars, which is phenomenal. By the way, I'm a firm believer process absolutely supports all of the 4 pillars. I'm one of the biggest believers in that. But if you had to narrow it down, I guess, to like, if there was, just like 1 or 2 key things that any startup founder or any business executive could be thinking about to help from an executive sponsorship perspective with supporting how their team builds out their process, builds out their playbooks, how they keep those playbooks updated, or how they do the controlling and the monitoring to keep a tight process. What are the 2 things that you want our listeners to kind of leave today's show just being like hyper focused on as they think about their own team's playbooks and process?
For me, we kind of do a dirty word assessment, which is on my alisteresam.com website, and in there we kind of assess people according to 4 parameters as to how healthy their business is in terms of process, and it's consistency, empowerment, improvement, and trust. And I think trust is the one that that when people do the test scores lowest. In terms of consistency, are you running things consistently? Are you empowering people? And those 2 conflict badly, right? Because consistency typically about putting process in place that restricts empowerment. So how do you balance those 2? And then how are you improving things? Because a lot of people look at process and say, process they think process is locked down, and actually we're in an ever-changing, innovative world.
It's a living thing. Yeah,
it needs to move on, and so things need to improve. And then trust is all about kind of are you micromanaging from above, or are you letting people get on with it? And do the people in your team feel that they are trusted, so that if a client has a problem, they have the remit to be able to try and fix that problem and make that client happy? Or do they feel restricted and sort of don't dare do anything that they know the client would want because they feel they'll get in trouble for it? So I think those 4 parameters are really important for me. I think the one that I think is the hardest, and the one I think people need to get, well, there's 2. One is about having consistency and empowering. How are you going to address that? And these are the key things that come out of my book, but they also have what the product Process Bliss helps with. But that balance between those 2 things, so you can have an empowered team that's also doing things consistently, because they conflict. And the other things that's interesting is the trust aspect, and it's really a leadership thing. And I think in a way, sometimes I read loads of leadership books, and I think they're all on the same topic, and it's letting go. as a business owner, you grow up in this business and you want it to be perfect. So you're kind of on top of it, and you're policing quality everywhere, and it comes across as micromanaging.
Yep.
And because you want this business to be perfect, you want customers to be happy. And what you don't realize is that if you just stop doing that and let everybody else fill the gap, then you go through a little patch where it gets worse. But coming out the other side, you get all these people who are all of a sudden far more motivated, and they're doing a much better job of looking after the clients and improving things. And then that's when you get the trust. So trust is an interesting one because it's a leap of faith. So to answer your question, the two things I think you've got to work on, and they're quite high level and theoretical in a way, is how are you going to get things done consistently whilst still empowering your team, and how are you going to get over that hump so that your team grow into the gap you leave behind, because they won't steal it from you. You have to create the gap for them. And when you create that gap, it causes some pain, but it's worth it in the long run. So
I love it, man. Those are awesome pieces of advice. Alister, I'd love to dive into the fourth and final CX pillar of feedback. So Eddie share at Process Bliss, even at some of the big places that you mentioned that you were working even earlier in your career. I'd love to kind of have you spend a few minutes just kind of giving us some ideas for what have been some of the best ways or the most effective ways that you've been able to kind of get customer feedback. So customer feedback is a huge part of it. And then I'd love to kind of hear you flip it on the other side, some of the best ways that you've been able to kind of collect that team feedback and that employee feedback. Spend a few minutes kind of talking about what you've learned with feedback.
Yeah, so Net Promoter Score is great. I love Net Promoter Score. You need to be a certain size before you can do it for a startup. But once you've got a Net Promoter Score, they say do what you measure, and people do what they measure. And Net Promoter Score is a great way of measuring because it's a benchmark, and because it just gives you it's the ability to benchmark other companies in your sector or other companies in the world.
Definitely. Yep.
It's absolutely fabulous. In terms of other feedback from customers and how you get that feedback, I think I don't know how much of your population, your listeners are SaaS, but it really is difficult to get feedback in SaaS because people expect to sign up online, play with a product, walk away, and the last thing they want is a conversation with somebody about kind of what's going wrong. So I think what you've got to do is get, as we said earlier, get close to the clients that you've got, build a relationship so that you can have those conversations and find out what's working and what's not, and build a level of trust so they don't mind admitting to you that this bit of the product is a little bit crap, and this and so you can get that feedback. In terms of, I'm not a big, I think that to me is the most valuable aspect, that kind of direct verbal stuff. I think sometimes it's really hard to interpret anything statistic based. There's loads of tools that you can have that will assess, will monitor, where people break down on their sign up journey and all this sort of stuff. And some of that can be really useful, but some of it can be so misleading because you don't really understand where the customer is or what they're doing.
Completely agree. Yep. I keep going. No,
I was going to say, if you can afford it, you get a customer in and sit them at the product. Much better to get a couple of potential newbies in, put them in front of the product and watch them, and then say why at the end say, why did you do that? And why did you do that? That's so much more valuable than having a database of 1,000 signups and trying to work out what happened to those signups.
I love that idea, and to be perfectly honest, so a lot of the work that we've been doing with some of our clients at CXChronicles, it's almost like this future evolution or this future potential focus area for so many customer success managers and account managers and people that are really they're in the business to keep customers happy, keep customers engaged, keep customer conversations happening. You just nailed it, man. I couldn't agree more, where that's one of the biggest value adders that you can provide to a customer as a customer success leader. The other part too is just that's the most incredible type of enriched feedback. So I completely agree with you too. Yeah. I think MPS and customer satisfaction, customer effort scoring, those are all fantastic. They give you great, clear insights. They give you benchmarks. There's enough notable information and data and just genuine performance results out there where you can absolutely kind of see how you stack and rank compared to some others. but nothing beats what the last part that you just said, where you actually are having those meaningful customer conversations, customer listening tours. If you can build or bake into your customer portfolio management strategy the way that you have incredible folks every single day talking to those customers, plugging that information and plugging that valuable feedback into your CRM or wherever you're doing your account overviews or wherever you're keeping all of your customer communications logged. And then over time, blending that stuff, man, there should be somebody on the team who is thinking about what are the trends? What are the themes? What are the buckets? What are the different things that we continue to see at a high frequency rate? What are the things where it's like, wait a minute, this is super low frequency. It might be interesting. It might be something that you're never going to do anything with. But like my point is, that is super, super important. The last part too is, I mean, one of the biggest parts I think of most CX and CS leadership, one of their biggest jobs, it's socializing that stuff. So like you've got to make sure that people across the entire business, whether it's marketing, sales, product, analytics, these people need to understand what this stuff is so that everybody can take that back to their own subject matter expertise area in the business and leverage that usable feedback. I think, and there's, frankly, I know that there's a ton of companies out there that are doing an incredible job with this. There's a lot of companies out there that are crushing it that don't really think about this. So there's a huge opportunity right there for businesses that aren't really leveraging some of that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
But Alister, well, look, this has been absolutely fantastic, man. I'm super appreciative of you coming on and sharing your story, sharing your background. It's been tons of interesting insights and learnings in this one. Before we wrap up, my friend, where can people get in touch with you, and where can people find out more about Process Bliss, and where can people find the dirty word, my friend?
We put together a landing page for you, processbliss.com/CX.
Awesome.
So if you go there, there's a guide that you can either go and find where to buy the Dirty Word book or learn about Process Bliss. And I think they might have even included a free offer on Process Bliss if for a period if people
That's
want.
awesome.
So I think it's a 6-month free offer. So yeah, processbliss.com/CX.
Fantastic. And we'll put that in the show notes, guys, so everybody can follow that link back to find Alister and the team. And then Alister, in terms of just anything coming up for you guys, any presentations, you guys have anything big that are coming up that you're getting excited for in the upcoming months ahead? Anything that you want people to know about, or maybe to kind of follow some of the work that you and the team at Process Bliss are doing?
Yeah, we were. The biggest thing we're working on at the moment within the kind of Process Bliss team is just some really cool new features into the product. So we've got a new feature coming out which will allow you to generate web forms which kick off processes. So if you wanted to deal with someone who's customer inquiries or customer complaints or anything to do with you can just generate a really quick web form, provide people the link, they can go in and they can just register they can basically kick off internal processes within your business for those customers. So I think that it's got a multitude of users, and I'm really interested to see what sort of customer service uses people will put it to, because we developed it generically because we took client feedback and you can see how they're gonna use that. But it's one of those things where there's hundreds and hundreds of ways that could be used to kind of, and the power for a customer to kick off an internal process in your business. It's quite cool. So,
and Alister, that's what we need. That's what we need our listeners thinking more about. How can you guys do exactly what Alister just said in your business? Because at the end of the day, that is like the power of CX and CS, guys. So Alister, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and joining the CX Chronicles podcast.
Appreciate the invite. Really loved it. Thank you. All right.